Hello everyone, I'm Falcon, and this is my very first build diary. Alright, so now that you see that, you might be thinking, what the heck is this? How does it work? How do I do it myself? So this is a Hexblast Blood Mage concept that I came up with over Sunday when I basically got very jaded on physical spells with the Witch archetype. I basically decided, okay, screw physical spells, let's go for Chaos. And this was the result. Now, if you are a Path of Exile 1 player and you know what you're doing, you can just follow everything that I wrote to the top left and you should be good to go. There is nothing too crazy about this build relative to Chaos hit spells in Path of Exile 1, which, relatively speaking, are usually pretty complicated, but it's nothing too absurd compared to those builds. Basically, we're using Blasphemy to generate the curses, we are using Sigil of Power for more DPS, we use Contagion and Dark Effigies as a Wither generator, as well as a means of applying freezes. We then use these very cool unique shoes called Corpse Wave to have really good clear. So yeah, this build overall, it has very good clear, it has pretty good single target, which I believe should scale to an absolutely ridiculous level in late game. And even in acts, it can have really good single target if you are fighting a pair of enemies or a boss surrounded by adds. You scale area of effect, skill effect duration, chaos damage, wither, freeze build-up on the tree. On your weapon, you want chaos gem level, you want chaos spell damage increase, and you want cast speed. If you have those three things, you're good to go. Priorities for every other piece of gear are generally going to be a spirit over life over resist. And that's kind of all you really need. I think the boots are kind of mandatory because they are just so extremely good for clear. Like, they make clear much nicer than without them. There's also one other unique that I will talk about later into the video that could be very useful, which is called Unfolding Down. This is basically for Sigil of Power. For ascendancies, essentially you go for Vitality Siphon for sustain. I think this one is pretty much mandatory because you need some way to offset the fact that Blood Mage consumes a lot of life when you're casting spells, and Hexblast uses a lot of mana, as you can probably see from the way my mana bar is moving up and down. Second note to take, I think, is probably anti-one-shotting, so Grasping Wounds. And then later in the game, I think you will probably take this off and you will switch for crit by going for Sunder of Flesh and Gore Spike. Okay, and that's pretty much it. So if you're an expert, you know what you're doing, this should be enough information. At the end of this video, there's also a bit of boss fighting that you can look at. All of them are Act 3 Cruel, and that will give you a few more ideas of basically how to build functions. For the rest of you, if you look at the length of this video, you can probably imagine we're about to go into pretty heavy detail of how this works. So what is this Hexblast concept? I will first go a little bit over my journey through the campaign and basically why did I go for this, and then I will go through every single individual mechanic that makes up this build. I will then talk a little bit further about the things that you need to scale to make it work, some of the passive tree notables that you pretty much have to take, a little bit more about gearing, and then I will talk a little bit about Blood Mage as a whole, so as an ascendancy, and how I think it works together with all of this. And then I will conclude by going into future work, so basically what do I think would be the steps to push this build further beyond. Because I do believe that this build, at least from all the analysis I've done so far, should actually have extremely good late game scaling. I'm pretty confident in this fact right now, at least from what I see, how it has progressed into the first maps, and with how much more room for improving it I can actually see it. Because, spoiler alert, what you're seeing right now on the screen, this is not crit. This is not yet crit. And with crit, this is going to be a lot more damage. Okay, so what is this concept? How does it all work? And, well, of course, before I go to that, first a little bit about the history. So basically, when I started PoE2, and preface for this, I would consider myself pretty much a Path of Exile 1 veteran. I played it for thousands of hours, and I've always been primarily a build creator. Like, this is the main reason I play Path of Exile. I really like making builds. Mostly in conventional league start, I will, in a league of Path of Exile 1, I will usually make something in the order of 5 to 10 builds. I never really publish these builds, I keep them to myself, and I usually like to make them very complicated. Like, I look for unique mechanics, basically, of how to make it work. Okay, so going into Path of Exile 2, I was hoping to do the same thing. I saw Blood Mage, and I was immediately very happy, because it looked very cool. Blood Mage has some really cool ascendency notables that can basically enable some very wacky builds. The main one that I was looking at was Bleed, so the notable that allows your elemental damage to inflict bleeds, basically, by giving you bleed magnitude. I was really interested in this notable, and I was going to make a physical spell build, physical spell witch, which I would later transition into an elemental witch, which would actually scale bleeds. So I would use basically a fire spell to trigger bleeds and ignites, and then I would scale those two ailments. That was the idea. Then I started playing the game, and I started with physical spells, so things like Bone Storm. And I played with Bone Storm, and I noticed very quickly that the way you play very heavily incentivizes you to use minions. And I did not really like that. I am not a minion guy. I just never liked the archetype. I like to deal damage myself. And I also didn't like that the game was kind of pressuring me into this. If you're doing physical spells, you're inevitably going to be scaling plus physical gem level. Because in Path of Exile 2, it seems, for spells, gem level is extremely important, even more so than in Path of Exile 1. From the analysis I've done so far, every single gem level increase is roughly a 17% more damage, which is a lot. This is quite a bit more than in many of the spells in Path of Exile 1. Most of them scale a little bit worse than that. 17% at every single level is a lot. So I started scaling these spells, and I realized that it just was basically, because I'm taking physical spell level ups, those specific mods, they benefit both the physical spells but also minions, because most of the minion notables are skill gems are also physical. So then I thought, well, also I have all this free spirit laying around. Well, I want to use that spirit. Clearly it should go into something like minions, right? Because I didn't have any auras at the time yet, or anything to basically use with meta gems. So then I started using minions, and that was really annoying. And also the clear wasn't very good. Bone Storm has pretty good single target, and I posted a video on this 2 days ago. I was doing the Act 1 boss, and I showcased pretty good damage on it when using Bone Storm as the primary damage delivery system. However, the clear really isn't that good. It is decent when you're using Power Siphon to generate power charges, and then using those to basically supercharge the Bone Storm. It's pretty okay with that, but you have to take Pierce, and it's also very, very slow. Like, you have to charge the full thing before it deals any significant damage. So it's not very clean. It doesn't feel even remotely like Path of Exile 1's clear would. And I felt like every single pack should not be a struggle. They should be more like what you see right now on the screen. Everything just evaporates. That's what I want to see from my build. I want a build that basically destroys the screens. Then I will feel like it's a good build. So around Act 3, at some point, I found on the vendor a pretty good stave. The stave had +3 Chaos gem level and something in the order of +100% increase Chaos damage. When I saw that, I was like, okay, I think this is the universe telling me that it's time to give up on this whole physical spell concept. Let's go for Chaos. Respecking wasn't that expensive. In Act 3, you can farm gold pretty reliably using the last few areas. So I started farming up a little bit, and then I respec'd pretty much all my points, and I went into Chaos. Then I posted a video where I fought the Queen of Filth using Hexblast. That video I don't think is a very good showcase, because back then is basically the first hour or so of using Hexblast, and I was basically just hitting the thing for nothing. It was a very slow kill. It didn't showcase Hexblast very well. Afterwards, I posted a second video where I was fighting in Act 2 Cruel, one of the bosses there, don't remember which one, but there it looked a lot better. And then people started begging me to basically give them the build. Like, what is this? How do I make this work myself? And okay, that's how we arrived to this point of making this video. Okay, so first about Hexblast. So Hexblast is a level 41 spell, so you cannot really use this until you get to Act 3. And basically it is inherited from Path of Exile 1, and it is a build, well, not a build, it's a spell that has a very strong upside and a very strong downside. Same as Path of Exile 1. Now, The upsides of this spell are basically that it has a very, very high base damage. It's extremely high relative to many of the other spells. And it is a Chaos hit spell. Chaos hit, same as in Path of Exile 1, is very, very powerful. It is basically an element, not an element, it's basically a type of damage that essentially has two huge benefits. The first one being that you can scale it with using Wither. And the second is that it is only resisted by Chaos resistance, which, generally speaking, is much lower than Elemental resistance. It's also usually a little bit easier to get Chaos penetration than Elemental penetration. So given these reasons, Hexblast actually has really, really good damage as a baseline. You start out with a lot of damage that you can work with. The downsides, however, are quite big. The first one is that to use Hexblast, you need to have an enemy that is already cursed. Basically, it costs a cursed instance to apply a single point of, not a point, but a single hit of Hexblast. So basically, you need an enemy that is cursed. You then can use Hexblast on it, and it will remove the curse and deal the damage. Now, if you want to do it a second time, you need to apply the curse again. So you need some kind of reliable means of generating curses on enemies around you. That's the first downside, is the main one that will define your build. The second downside is that it has very, very low crit chance, which means it's pretty difficult to scale with crit. Now, if you have spent some time looking at the Blood Mage ascendency, you're probably already thinking, that might not be a very big downside. You'd be right. That's gonna come into the concept later. So anyways, so we have this spell that's pretty cool if we can overcome these downsides. And the way I'm doing it is using Blasphemy. After that, I basically use all kinds of additional shenanigans to beef up the damage. So at this point, I think we can stop looking at videos and I can just start looking at spells, looking at the skill gems, the supports, and we can talk about it a little bit further. Alright, so what is this whole concept? Let's just look at the actual skills and try to understand this. So Hexblast, our little skill that we'll be using for our build as the main damage delivery spell. So the main downside of Hexblast is the whole curse thing. How do we apply curses? So let's first just solve that little problem, get it out of the way. So there are multiple ways to try to apply curses rapidly. First, I must note that the naive approach to apply a curse would probably be to just basically apply them manually. So you walk up to a pack, you hit a curse, you wait for these 2 seconds, it gets applied, and then you cast Hexblast, and then you repeat the whole process, chaining between the two back and forth, back and forth. The problem with this is that, as you can imagine, this is completely ridiculous for any real-world situation, like a real fight, because essentially you are spending so much time waiting for this delay to actually pop, to be able to pop the Hexblast. And also, this delay is how often you can actually use Hexblast, because every single time you have to wait those 2 additional seconds plus the cast time, so now your maximum potential cast time of Hexblast is very, very low. Cast per second, basically. So manually casting the curses is just not realistic. I do not recommend this. In PoE1, we did have a way to overcome this. So there used to be a very cool keystone. I think it was a keystone that basically made curses in AoE, a lingering AoE. Sure, in PoE2, we don't seem to have something like that. So okay, manually casting curses is not going to work. A second approach would be cast on crit. You could try this. I have considered it. This is probably possible. The problem with this, however, is that you need an initial hit to be able to apply the first curse so that you can use it on a pack. This makes clear extremely annoying. Now, in PoE1, we also had a mod, Curse on Hit, that you could get on rings. I'm pretty sure this is probably not in PoE2. Maybe it is, I don't know, but yeah, I don't think that's also a solution. The third way, and this is the one I went with, which I think is the most reliable, is to use Blasphemy. So Blasphemy is a metagem. It's an aura that basically turns your curses into auras. Okay, so that's pretty nice. You socket a bunch of curses in there, all of them will get applied on your enemy. Keep in mind, in PoE2, just as in 1, you can only apply a single curse on an enemy at once, unless you have additional special keystones or mods that would increase this limit. 1 curse per mob initial limit. Okay, so Blasphemy is cool. It will basically make it so we don't have to cast this. It will basically always apply the curse, and it will keep reapplying the curse on anything around us, which means that if you walk into range of a mob and you cast Hexblast, the Blasphemy will immediately reapply the curse, and you can immediately reapply Hexblast. This is perfect. The downside is that Blasphemy has an absolutely horrible AoE range. It inherits the range from the curse. Now, you saw me cast this curse, right? And this looked pretty cool, right? Because like I was basically casting like the AoE was pretty large, right? Like this is a pretty nice circle. So if you imagine it around me, that sounds pretty reasonable. The problem is that socketed into into Blasphemy without any additional mods, the actual circle radius of something like this is basically melee, which means that if you wanted to use Blasphemy out of the box to apply Hexblasts, to apply curses for Hexblast, you will need to basically be in melee of all your enemies. This is horrible because you're playing a witch. Fundamentally speaking, witches are not supposed to be in melee because they do not have armor and they do not have evasion. You could build these things if you want, of course, it's Path of Exile, you can do anything you want. However, generally speaking, the way the tree is laid around, and the armor that you want to acquire, which is going to be usually energy shield based, is not going to have a lot of ES, it's not going to have a lot of evasion or armor. Because of this, you don't have good physical mitigation, you only have good mitigation against spells and AoEs because of energy shield, and so you don't want to be in melee of anything. Okay, so the first problem we have to solve after we solve the problem of applying curses is that, well, we need to increase our AoE. However, luckily for us, if you look at the passive tree, it actually has all kinds of nodes for AoEs. Most importantly being this whole wheel that basically has a ton of area of effect. It's actually much better than in PoE 1. So we have some here. We also, I'm pretty sure, have some here. Yeah, so we have these two wheels, and these two wheels together is already quite a lot. On top of that, if you really need more, you could also get increased AoE effect support. However, I suggest not doing that and using that support for other spells, which we'll get to in a moment. So, okay, we use Blasphemy, we scale area of effect, and this will make it so that we are able to apply Hexblasts. It is worth noting that increased area of effect is also extremely useful for Hexblast itself, because this spell, while being a single target spell, it hits a single target, it then casts an AoE around that target. This AoE, if you scale it far enough, has a very neat property of being able to shotgun. Because Hexblast, if we actually look at the spell itself, has a very key line which says maximum 9 explosions per cast. What this means is that if you have a pack of 9 mobs and you cast Hexblast on those 9 mobs, it will basically apply on all 9 of them, and each mob will take 9 points of damage. They will basically have a shotgunning effect. Now, shotgunning in PoE1 was largely removed. There's not many ways of getting it. In PoE2, shotgunning seems to be in full force. You can do it. So Hexblast is a very good example of this. So if you scale AoE, this means that if you have a pack and there's a rare in the middle of the pack, the Hexblast is probably going to one-shot the rare. This can be very powerful. The second point is that if you have bosses, for example, a pair of bosses, those two bosses are likely going to be taking double damage from your Hexblast. There are a few bosses in the game that are like this, and I have seen this for sure. I can confirm 100% it works. You will deal double damage. This is very, very useful. Okay, so we have Hexblast. We need to apply curses. We use Blasphemy. We scale area of effect. This makes Blasphemy work fine and allows us to stay at range. It also makes Hexblast quite good at shotgunning. Okay, so now we have a very, very strong curse chaos spell that can hit. Now, the reason that these spells are really, really good, why Chaos is very good, is, as I said earlier, largely because of effects such as Withered. So now, what is Withered? So if we look at our tree, and we have a wheel like this, which is a small little wheel dedicated to Withered. Withered is an effect that basically increases the chaos damage taken by the enemy. This is really, really powerful. I cannot overstate how powerful this mod is. Because in Path of Exile, fundamentally speaking, multiplicative mods, damage mods, are extremely powerful. Because increases are not multiplicative. If you have 11% increased damage and then you have a second mod like this, it is not 11% times 11%. It's 11% plus 11% for a total of 22% increased damage, rather than 1.11 times 1.11, which would be a little bit more than that, right? Because of this, at some point you will have about, like, I don't know for PoE2, but for a PoE1, it used to be the case that you end up with something around 600 increased damage, at which point an individual node of increased damage becomes extremely pitiful. It does almost nothing. And because of this, if you can have additional scaling sources of damage that basically multiply against the previous ones, it's very powerful. Withered is one of them, and in this case, we can have up to 10 Wither stacks, each one 5%. This is a 50% more damage. On top of this, as you can see from the wheel itself, we have really powerful increased withered effect. So we have 10%, 10%, 20%. That's 40%. On top of this, jewels can also have increased effect of withered, up to 15% per jewel. You can very easily, in a conventional build, end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, and I think probably at this point 5 jewels. I think it will be very easy to get 5 jewels, each jewel 15% withered. Add the nodes, you can have 100% increased withered effect, which by the end of it is basically going to give you in the range of 100% more damage on top of everything you have so far. This is massive. This by itself makes it so that by investing a little bit into your mods, a little bit into your spell setup, you can basically make chaos spells hit for double damage relative to elemental spells. This is where the power comes from for basically these types of spells. This is why chaos hit can be very, very powerful if you can overcome the downsides. Okay, so at that point we need withered to make it work. So how do we apply withered? Well, there are multiple ways to apply withered in PoE2. A primary one is by using the Withering Presence aura. So this is a buff, it costs 30 spirit, not too much, and it will apply withered every 2 seconds, and this withered is going to last for 4 seconds. The good thing about this is that withered duration, as far as I can tell, scales with your increased skill duration. So basically these nodes. Increased skill effect duration should scale withered, as far as I can tell. It is also not too difficult to get a lot of skill effect duration. We have the wheel here, and I think we have one more wheel somewhere around. Was it here? No, it wasn't here. It was somewhere. There was one other small wheel for this, as far as I can remember. But there is a little bit more skill effect duration. So you can scale that, and this will mean that withered, I think by the end you can probably get this pretty easily to something like 8 seconds. 8 seconds every 2 seconds means that you will maintain around 3 to 4 withered stacks on an enemy at all times just off Withering Presence. This is already getting you 40% of the way. It's a 40% more damage just from having a single aura socketed. That's powerful. Okay, so how do we get the remaining 6 to 7 stacks? So we can do that using a support called Withering Touch. Withering Touch makes it so that a spell that you combine it with, actually doesn't have to be a spell, it can be anything, any attack or spell, it will apply withered. Okay, so if we can socket a spell or whatever skill that does a lot of rapid hits on an enemy, it will keep applying withered, and this is how we're going to maintain our 10 stacks. Dark Effigy makes sense because it's already a chaos totem. Like, it's basically built for this. Like, it is one of the gems that you can get when you're looking at witch nodes. It's one of the witch spells, right? Now, the way Effigy works is that basically you need to have a chaos damage over time effect applied on an enemy, and if you do, then the totem will keep hitting the enemy. As far as I can tell, the way this works is that basically for every single chaos damage over time debuff on an enemy, it will apply a single projectile. So, if you have 3 debuffs, that means you will hit 3 projectiles with the Dark Effigy at once. This means an immediate 3 stacks. So that means with a cast time of 1 second, it will take you only 2 seconds, together with Withering Presence, to have maximum withered stacks on an enemy. Massive. Okay, so Dark Effigy seems like a very good rapid-fire way of applying withered stacks. Now, of course, the problem here that we have to solve, again, is that we need chaos damage over time debuffs. For that, we can use either Essence Drain, which is basically a targeted skill. So basically you shoot a projectile, the projectile lands at the enemy, and for 4 seconds it's going to be dealing chaos damage over time. which again, you can scale using skill effect duration. Another one is Contagion. It's the very first one you get, I think, from the Chaos spells. This one lasts for 5 seconds. Again, you can scale this with duration. Also, with Essence Drain is kind of interesting. Additional effect from the gemstones is going to be up to 1 second duration. So then it equalizes 5 seconds for this, 5 seconds for Contagion. So 5 seconds. Now add this up together with skill effect duration, and I have added a lot of it. I had so much actually that my debuff duration is now 13.3 seconds, which means I need to recast Contagion once every 13 seconds, and I need to recast my effigy once every 12 seconds, and they will keep applying wither stacks on my enemy. Okay, so that's the jankiness of this build. That basically when you start a fight, you will always need to cast the wither totem, and you will need to cast either an essence drain or a Contagion. And then you will need to recast this after 13 seconds or whenever your totem dies. And in boss fights it dies quite often. But once you do this, you have now applied a lot of withered. Okay, so this gives you a very large damage increase. Okay, Hexblast is now good. Now, keeping with the concept of trying to make everything fit together and make all the downsides into upsides and stuff like that, the next thing to consider is that if we're already using these damage over time spells, why don't we also incorporate Chaotic Freeze, which is a very cool support gem, which makes that chaos damage over time, such as from Contagion, is also going to make it so that your chaos hits, are going to apply freeze. This is insanely powerful because Hexblast has a really, really high base chaos hit, which makes it excellent for applying Contagion. Not Contagion, but applying this Chaotic Freeze. As you saw from the boss fight, within the order of like 20 seconds, I was able to apply 2 completely separate freeze stacks on a boss. This is massive. This gives you so much free damage uptime when you don't have to deal with any mechanics. Also, if you use Persistence as a second support, you will also be able to get a lot more skill effect duration. Okay, so, in summary, we have Blasphemy, we have Withering Presence, we have Dark Effigy, we have Essence Drain, we have Contagion. With all of these added together, we have a Hexblast which we can cast permanently. We have no downsides for it. We just keep casting it all over and over again. We can't keep doing it. And we are going to be doing this with full Wither stacks for up to 100% more damage. And also, on top of all of this, it can also freeze. Perfect. Okay. What's the third part of this concept? Because we're not done yet. So we got Blasphemy, we have Contagion, we have our effigies. Next is the Sigil of Power. And sorry, I didn't go in the same order as I did in the actual list. I just kind of forgot about it. But anyways, so Sigil of Power. This is another very, very interesting spell. So you can get this spell if you have... wait, let me move this around a little bit. So you get this if you wear a stave. A stave that grants the skill level 15 Sigil of Power. Now, Sigil of Power is really, really, really interesting. Basically, it works quite differently from Path of Exile 1. So in PoE1, we had this as well, but the idea was that essentially you place AoE, and also let me move this completely out of the way for now. So you place this large AoE circle, and while you're standing in the circle, if you cast spells, these spells are going to basically, over time, wait, let me try to show this a little bit. You see it will basically build up stages. These stages, each, give you more damage over time. Now there was a way to do this little thing, I forgot how to do this. Okay, doesn't matter. I forgot how to do the whole chaining of going into one from the other, but doesn't matter. So anyways, oh wait, actually, I think I do. I do this, and then I do this. Perfect. Okay. So buff grants 15% more spell damage per stage. And you can have up to 4 stages, which means at total, you can have up to, 52% more damage using Sigil of Power. In PoE1, Sigil of Power worked in the way that you had to basically spend a flat amount of mana per stage. This meant that you could only really use this effectively in a mana stacking character. The build had to stack mana. In this case, we're going to be stacking, we're not going to stack any mana, but because in PoE2, the stages are gained based on maximum mana spent, so you need to spend half your mana pool. This means that you can have a very small mana pool And in my case, it's very, very small, and it's going to give you a lot of Sigil of Power stages. So this is another way to get another 50% more multiplier on top of everything you have so far. Okay, so Sigil of Power, I think, is very, very cool, and it's something we should be considering a lot in builds. Now, I got Magnified Effect on this one because I wanted the Sigil of Power to be very, very large, because this gives me a lot of room to maneuver. Because then basically if I'm using blinks, so for example this one, it's basically from one edge of the arena to the other one. So wait, let's see fully. Yeah, it's basically from one corner to the next to use a blink, which is perfect for me. It means this is my play area. I will basically fight everything inside the Sigil of Power when I'm fighting bosses, right? So I think AoE makes a lot of sense on the Sigil. Otherwise, your maneuverability is going to be limited a little bit too much. Okay, so I have to now note a very intricate part of this build. So we have been scaling AoE, and we have been scaling skill effect duration. This is why Sigil of Power is perfect here. It all comes together here, right? It's benefiting from both of the same mods. However, we really don't want to have a lot of mana, right? Having a lot of mana is not very useful to us actually, because we want to apply Sigil of Power. And Hexblast already has a pretty large mana cost. So in this current case, if you look at my mana cost and you look at the mana cost, mana that I have in total, Hexblast is actually using up to almost a quarter of my mana bar, which means I only need 2 casts of Hexblast to be able to trigger a stage of Sigil of Power. Now, why do I have so little mana? It's because I'm using a very special unique, which I think is a really powerful unique for this build, which is Enfolding Dawn. The idea with this one is that basically, well, it has 2 interesting mods. The first one is that it gives a lot of spirit, 100 spirit. This is very useful for us because we're already spending a lot of spirit on Blasphemy for curses. We're also spending it on Withering Presence, and we're also most likely going to spend it on more things. I think Blink is an extremely powerful spell, not spell, but aura, which turns your dodge into a blink. I think it's really, really powerful from all the mobs that I fought so far, and you will see examples of this at the end of this video as well. Blink has saved my ass a lot, so I think there's a lot of spirit you need. So this will give you a lot of spirit. But the second one is that it has a downside, that intelligence does not provide any maximum mana. This is actually an upside for us, because it means that we are able to apply Sigil of Power stages very, very rapidly, right? We don't really care about having a large mana pool, because we're not scaling mana regeneration, as you're about to see. We don't care, we don't need a big pool. We're not scaling mana, right? So we artificially keep our mana pool very low using Enfolding Dawn, so the downside becomes an upside. Okay. So at this point, we're scaling our damage using Withered and Sigil of Power, and also all the generic shenanigans of Hexblast as a hit spell. We're also able to apply freezes. So this covers almost everything. Now, another piece of the puzzle is the Decompose. So I showed this unique. There's a second unique, this one, called Corpse Weight. Corpse Weight is crazy. So Corpse Weight is this very, very fancy little unique. So it's basically unique shoes with a very unique skill that consumes corpses to produce a cloud of flammable noxious gas. As you already saw previously in the video, when basically I was walking around and, well, stuff was basically covered in a poisonous mist. The thing with this one is that this poison, I'm pretty certain it scales off your chaos damage, which we are already scaling to high heavens because we're doing Hexblast. On top of this, it scales off skill effect duration, which we are scaling to high heavens. It also scales off area of effect, which again we are scaling. So these boots, this spell is actually perfect for our build. It scales off everything that we are already scaling. And as you saw in the video, it ends up being the case that this thing actually deals a tremendous amount of damage to everything around you. It's going to make you sit in a basically pool of death. This is amazing for clear. I think it is almost mandatory for this build, just because it benefits so much. Also, for this to work very well, I highly, highly suggest having the support comorbidity. This one makes it so that you can basically have 2 curses, the downside being that you have a reduced poison duration, which doesn't matter, because this thing is an area of effect. It's a persistent area of effect, so it keeps reapplying the poison over and over again. This downside does not exist. It's only an upside. It's double damage with the poison. This is why you could see so much dot damage coming from comorbidity. Also, on top of all of this, this is, by the way, a chaos damage over time, which applies with effigy. So if you cast an effigy, it will actually work off Decomposed and hit literally every single mob inside your area. Okay, so Decompose, Sigil of Power, Contagion, Hexblast, Blink, Essence Drain. Essence Drain I don't actually use in fights. Sometimes I will throw it in there because it's still a pretty powerful damage over time. I don't remember. Yeah, 1.3 seconds. It's something, right? If my Hexblast DPS is 5, and remember that Sigil of Power and Withered both work on both of these. So this is basically 20% more damage if I hit the Essence Drain. I think it's fine, so I sometimes throw it in. But most of the time I just use Contagion because it lasts longer. 20% longer duration, 25% longer duration for me is more important because I don't want to keep recasting these skills over and over again. Okay, so at this point we have pretty much everything, right? So what do we have? So Blasphemy, Sigil of Power, Contagion, Dark Effigy, Decompose. Okay, pros and cons. So we can talk a little bit about this. So now that we have all of these things combined, basically this gives us really, really good clear. At this point, I guess I can start going through the clear video again. So basically, as you can see, we have these noxious clouds that are spawning all over the place. And you can see the area of effect is completely ridiculous. I can assure you, the base boots without doing anything, it doesn't have that much of an AoE. But together with our AoE and increased duration, you can see this becomes a complete like mist of death, in which literally everything dies. So I think this is really, really powerful. Okay, so this is basically for regular stuff. The way it looks for boss fights is basically you start the fight off by casting Sigil of Power, because this is the longest casting one. It will benefit from every single consecutive spell that you cast, because they do cost quite a bit in our case. Like, all of them cost a significant part of our mana pool. Next to cast the Effigy, next to cast Contagion. And at this point, basically, you can start casting your Hexblast, and you can see it immediately starts applying Frost. Freeze. Yeah, I can freeze pretty easily. You can see that our Wither stacks are already at 80%. So actually, if we count the seconds, like I'm just kind of curious to check this. So the fight starts, right? Let's just look at the time for this. So it was 4 seconds. 10 seconds. So 6 seconds into the fight, we have full Wither stacks. I'm pretty sure you can do better than that, actually. But yeah, so for the start, 6 seconds is pretty good. Full Wither stacks, yeah, we're doing a lot of damage. We can also see that our Sigil of Power got full stages very quickly as well. So as we saw, the cap was 1 second per stage, which means you need only 4 seconds in total to be able to get to cap. So yeah, this is pretty quickly. You get full damage ramp very quickly. It's also very cool that bosses can actually get frozen multiple times in a row. Some of them don't. You will see the Act 3 final boss. I won't spoil it yet. There you can actually not freeze it at some specific instances, but most of these bosses you can. Yeah, that works out very well. Now, you might have noticed there's one issue here. So what about the mana regeneration? Like, this is something I haven't talked about yet. So let's talk about it a little bit. So the way we solve mana regeneration is with a flask. It's really simple as that. So because we're not scaling mana regeneration, because it doesn't make sense for us, because it scales off percentage mana, like mana regeneration is generally something in the order of 1% mana per second, which you can scale up. We have not a lot of mana, so we use a pot. Now, here's the thing. I believe for this build, late game, it will be very, very important to somehow scale up your mana flask. Like, you need to buff this thing up, because the mana flask becomes your main source, like your entire source of sustain for DPS. So I have done the math. This specific mana flask, for me, gives something in the order of 90 seconds worth of hex blasting, aka around 90 hex blasts. Actually, no, the math is now probably wrong because my Hexblast is down to 0.65 seconds. So something in the range of a minute at this point. But basically, we rely entirely on the Mana Flask, which means if you could get Mana Flask sustained, that would be very good. But without it, here's the thing. You basically need to make sure that your fight does not last more than a minute. However, I think if your boss fight is lasting more than a minute, your build is bad. So I think actually it makes perfect sense. Just use a Mana Flask. You don't need more than that. It's basically just in time, like with our resources. We don't need a large mana pool. We don't need the regeneration. If a single Mana Flask can sustain enough mana for us to kill a boss, that's all we really need. And Mana Flask giving much more mana than our pool means that we're basically, well, yeah, we have enough. So this is basically this chest piece plus a Mana Flask, have a small pool, Sigil of Power. This is how we can beef it up to get us 4 stages, and then we're good to go. Okay, so now we solve that. So basically, the pro, as you saw from the video itself, like we have these curse clouds that are really, really good for clear. I think it should be amazing in rituals, because in ritual you will cover the whole area, and then basically mobs will just spawn in and just immediately die. In ultimatum, I saw it was very, very good for me. In trials, it was also pretty nice. I thought it pretty good, worked pretty well. It should also be good for strong boxes, as you saw in the video itself. So yeah, lots of upsides for clear. Mostly because of these boots. Like the boots are really good. The boots will basically give you area clear once like in the whole area, while Hexblast itself will give you the single target as well as just the initial burst of damage. Like start killing stuff that you can then detonate with Decompose. For single target, as I noted earlier, basically, yeah, the main thing is that it has really, really good damage if you have multiple enemies clumped together. If not, I think the damage is still pretty good. Like you saw, it was pretty sizable. My staff is, it's a good staff, but it's not an amazing staff. Like it could be a lot better, I think. It basically has 3 really, really good mods, which scales it quite heavily. However, I don't have a lot of increased chaos damage yet. Like all my other gear is complete garbage. Like look at this. Like this is basically 2 mods, like a few mods. This is literally nothing. Like my helmet is literally just 2 silly mods. Yeah, I don't have really good gear here. And still I deal pretty significant damage. However, and this is where I guess we can come to the next side, which is basically we could go crit. But now look at this, I guess at this point I should also talk a little bit about what are you scaling in total. So to recap, you want to scale your area of effect, you want to scale skill effect duration, chaos damage, withered effect, and also freeze buildup. So at this point we can look at the tree a little bit. So in the tree itself, what am I actually doing here? Also, ascendancies, I'm going to talk about it at the end, don't worry. So in the tree itself, we care about the cast speed, of course, we care about chaos damage, so we went through like this. And optimization, I think, is going to be to go like this at the start, which is the same as in PoE1. At some point, these nodes are not good enough, and you just basically go via this route just to save on some points, which you will use on something more useful. I get chaos damage wherever I can. So yeah, this was the second wheel. So chaos damage and skill effect duration. This wheel is amazing. This wheel gives you area of effect for curses as well as curse effect and hindered. This is also really, really good. So I would definitely get this wheel as well. They're close together. Increased area of effect, increased area of effect, increased area of effect, and AoE damage. Chaos damage. Again, increase, super good. So this is good for damage, this is good for damage, this is good for literally everything, this is good for enabling the build overall. Then we really want to path all the way over here to get even more chaos damage as well as withered effect. So this is basically a 40% more damage in these 3 nodes alone, which is insane. It's worth pathing here just for this. We get more skill effect duration because we care about it a lot. Another thing is, as you saw, freeze has become a pretty important part of the build, which means that, funnily enough, while playing a chaos build, we actually want to scale freeze buildup. I don't think this is super important in later, because at some point we'll have so much base hit damage that we will not need this. But for now, I think it's pretty nice because we can invest very few points. So I invest 1, 2, 3, and where else? 1, 2, 3. 4, 5, 6, 7. I invest 7 points, but I get in total 20, 20, 50, 65, 85, what is this? 105. 105% freeze buildup, which is double. So at the cost of 7 points, we are casting freeze as if we had double damage. I think it's worth. At some point, it will not be worth, because I think these nodes will turn into crit nodes. But for now, this is pretty nice to just increase our freeze effect a little bit. The last things that I got were, currently in the tree, I got some recoup, because we need sustain. This comes into play with our ascendency. But yeah, this was like the final thing that I have gotten so far. And then one more thing, this. Whispers of Doom. So Whispers of Doom is a very nice keystone that basically gives you an additional curse up to the limit. The downside is double activation delay, which, we are using blasphemy, it doesn't matter. We have infinite curses. So there's no downside, this keystone is only an upside. It's perfect for our build. Definitely get this, because curses themselves are really powerful. At the end of the day, Despair is minus 35% chaos damage. Temp Chains makes our effects last longer. 25% slower, which is basically another quarter increase to the duration on top of everything. Of course, Blasphemy decreases both of these by half, so it's as if you had one curse, but still, it's one really beefy curse. Curses are really powerful, you should totally use them. I think these two are the way to go. At some point, if I will be able to, I will get the third curse. It will be Enfeeble, because Enfeeble is minus damage. This is the last thing that is very useful to us. Okay, so that's on the tree. In terms of gear, so what do we do there? Basically, for the staff itself or band, it doesn't matter really. You can do either one, but actually you really want to have a... Actually, wait, let me think about this a little bit. No, for the ultimate version of this build, you actually need to have a Sigil of Power. You need to have a stave. The stave will give you Sigil of Power. Okay, so for this, the most important mods are basically Chaos Damage Increase, Casting Speed, and Chaos Spell Skills. These are Chaos Gem levels, right? These are the most powerful ones. Chaos Gem levels in general are really powerful in PoE2, so definitely get these. So this will be our baseline. On gear itself, you want to get life and resistances as two priorities, and the third main priority would be Spirit. Spirit is, I think, the biggest priority because we really need Spirit. This chest piece, while it is nice right now, at some point will be horrible. Like, really, all it gives us is Spirit and a little bit of elemental resistance. This is not good enough. At some point, we will want to replace this with a rare chest piece. I am certain it must have Spirit on it, then life, and then resistances. That will be the ultimate chest piece for this build. So yeah, you definitely want to have that. So I would say for the weapon priorities are essentially a Chaos Gem level, Chaos Spell damage increase, and casting speed. For everything else, Spirit, Life, Resists. These two uniques I think are very good as leveling uniques. Corpse weight is probably going to be also removed at some point, because if we at some point turn into crit, and we will turn into crit at some point, this will become pretty bad. It's only good right now because we're not scaling crit, we're just generically scaling chaos damage, so for now it's very good. Maybe it will still retain for a while, but still only having 10% movement speed is pretty terrible. Movement speed is really important in PoE2, so I think at some point you want to upgrade this into rare boots with higher movement speed. And you just have to suck it up that at some point we have to give up Decompose. But for leveling, it's amazing. Definitely keep it. Okay, so at this point we have covered most things. We have talked about the tree. We have talked about the gear a little bit. We have talked about the skill gems and everything. I didn't talk about the supports at all. So basically, okay, Despair Temp Chains in here. For the effigy, I got Font of Mana, which is just, I don't know, a random thing to give me a little bit more mana regeneration. I don't know. It's basically free. Why not use it? It will give me a little bit more sustain. I use Blink. Blink is very powerful. I use Ingenuity for more cooldown reduction, and Arcane Tempo, which gives me more cast speed. I am actually not certain if this does anything. So actually, I don't know, like, as you see, like, this is pretty fast. And if I equip it, okay, I think what it does is it increases the actual travel time, like decreases the travel time a little bit. So maybe it doesn't matter too much. So I might put this on something else eventually, but so far I am very, very socket tight. I don't have the Jeweler Orbs yet, so I'm just keeping it on this. Hexblast itself, Controlled Destruction makes sense right now because we're not scaling critical chance. Once we do, we will replace this with something that scales of critical chance. There's many supports for that. I get Concentrated Effect because this has a lot of damage. 40% more is a lot, and the increased area, the less area of effect is something that I have already negated by having a ridiculous amount of base increased area of effect. However, this one I will also at some point remove because once I lose the boots, I will not longer have the clear from Decompose, then I will need more clear from Hexblast, so at that point, Concentrated Effect will become bad. We'll remove it. Currently I use Inspiration, because without Inspiration, this is actually a ridiculous 128 mana, which is a third of my pool. It's too much. At that point, you will not be able to sustain this. At least I was not able to. I will note, at some point in the life of this build, I will be switching this for Life Tap. I'm pretty certain at some point it will make a lot more sense to basically make Hexblast cost only life. This will only make sense once we have ridiculous life sustain, which is where the ascendency will come into. For now, we need to use mana. We cannot offload everything to life because we want to benefit from Sigil of Power. At some point, we will charge Sigil of Power using Contagion, Essence Drain, Dark Effigy, and all the other stuff. Once we do that, basically, I think it will make sense to make this into life tap so that we can actually sustain it. Because at some point, it will just not be sustainable. We don't want to be losing like this entire support jump slot just for this. At some point, we switch it to life tap, and then we will be able to make Hexblast have, I don't know, something ridiculous, like 0.1 second cast time, which is 10 casts per second, which will not be sustainable for mana, but it will be sustainable for life once we get to the endgame. Okay. For Contagion, Chaotic Freeze, Persistence, so yeah, I want this to be longer. The Ascendancy one, I got Cannibalism and Clarity. These are just two random auras that I could fit in because I have some excess Spirit. Once I am tight on Spirit, when I remove this chess piece, I will remove these two. For now, I think this one is pretty good. Cannibalism, I think, is something you want to keep. This is very, very good because Blood Mage really, really suffers from sustain. Like, it really needs life sustain. This helps a little bit. Sigil of Power, AoE, I think it's very good. Commodity, you have to get the poisons. I guess I could also get some additional increases here for poison. I didn't bother yet. At some point I will. That's kind of it. Once I get more sockets, then I will think about the additional ones and what I will do. For Hexblast specifically, this is all going to be filled with crit stuff eventually. Okay, so that's almost everything. Let's talk about the Ascendancy. Blood Mage. So, I did not go into this build with the intention of doing a Blood Mage Hexblast. I was going to do a Hexblast Bleed build, because I wanted to use this node. Well, that has not panned out, so we make do with what we have. And it just happens to be that I think Blood Mage is the perfect Ascendancy for Hexblast. The main reason is this. Sunder the Flesh. So there's this little node that, when I saw this initially during the release, not the release, but when they posted the Ascendancies, I thought that this was bad. I thought 50% is just bad because most spells in the game already have a lot. So actually we can check this out. I just want to actually have this comparison side by side. So I don't know, let's grab a random skill gem. Just look at this. So if we look at elemental spells, right? Something like Comet. Comet has 13% crit chance. Fireball, okay, that's pretty bad. So a lot of these had quite a bit actually. Yeah, for example, Eye of Winter has 12%. And if I remember correctly, Lightning also has a lot. So 10%, yeah, I think Arc was also pretty nice. 9%, 10%, 9%, 13%. Okay, so for example, Ice spells have a very large amount of crit. Lightning has a decent amount. I assume then all of the... Is it the case? Yeah, the Fire ones have a very little amount of crit. When it comes to physical spells, I mean, come on, 15%. This is completely insane. It has a lot. And yes, I will keep ignoring the guy because this is a little bit more important right now. So yeah, all of these are really good, but Hexblast itself, it only has a pitiful 7% crit chance. So this would imply that Hexblast is not very good to use with crit. However, this single Ascendancy point goes from 7% to 15%. This is effectively a double damage mod, a double damage node, making it super powerful. The other problem was this. Gore Spikes is only 1% crit damage per 40 life. In the early game, this is horrible. However, from everything that I have seen of the game so far, from looking at the tree, looking at the items, looking at the mods, I am pretty confident in super late game you should be able to get to at least 4,000 life. I'm sure it's going to be between 4,000 and 8,000. If, in some hypothetical universe, you can get to 8,000 life, and I think for Blood Mage, scaling life is really, really important in general, this will become 200% crit damage. And from the tree so far, I would say that 400 to 500% increased crit damage is probably where we're going to land at, which is the same as PoE1, which means this also is going to be almost double damage. So double damage, double damage. In total, 4 times the damage from these two. And these are additional scaling dimensions. Okay? So I think late game, these two are really, really powerful nodes that make Blood Mage really nice. In the early game, so of course you're forced to take Sanguimancy. This thing, so what can I tell you about it? This is a very complicated node. Like there's a lot of things to it. Most people who started Blood Mage probably already realized, they probably noticed, the biggest issue is that this is actually difficult to sustain, especially if you cannot spawn Life Remnants. So here's the thing, you have to critically strike an enemy to actually spawn these. While this build is not producing crit, it cannot spawn life remnants, which means I have no sustain from this to offset the increased life cost. This is really, really bad. So I've been struggling quite a bit with sustain. Because of this, the very first node I took after the initial one was Vitality Siphon for the 10% spell damage. This is why my life pool doesn't really move, even though it should. This is basically offsetting it. Now, from what I can tell, Leech, if we just do Leech, right, and we just look at this, Leech is not present on the tree. There's no Leech. There's only increase of Leech effect. This is really important. With there not being Leech on the tree, it is possible that Spell Leech is actually almost impossible to get. It could be that this is the only way to get Spell Leech on life. Now, if you can, and Leech in general in PoE is very powerful. It's pretty much one of the most important sustain mechanics in the game. A build without Leech is usually not a very good build, unless it's a dot build, then they cannot have Leech. Okay, but that's another thing. This 10% in late game, once your Hexblast starts dealing 1,000,000 damage or something, and I'm pretty sure at some point it will deal 1,000,000 damage, this will become really powerful. This will start basically leeching you for whatever the cap is. I assume it's probably going to be like 20% of your maximum life per second. I think that's probably the leech cap. I haven't checked. But yeah, this will become really, really powerful. So this node, I think, is forced. These two nodes are forced in late game. So the question is, what do you do with the last point? Well, it's surely not Blood Barbs because we're not doing bleed. So it could be open source, but I see no reason. A manually casted curse is going to have twice the effectiveness, but your Hexblast is going to remove it. And then it gets overwritten by Blasphemy. And you want to have Blasphemy anyways. You need the reliability. Because of this, I think the only logical option is Grasping Wounds. What I will do, right after recording this video, I'm going to be doing the trial, and I'm going to take Grasping Wounds as my third set of points. Once I transition into crit, I'm going to remove Grasping Wounds, and I'm going to get these two nodes. That's basically the idea. So for now, basically, you get Sanguinancy, you get Vitality Siphon, then you get Grasping Wounds. At some point, you remove Grasping Wounds, and you get these two nodes. If, instead, there do exist ways to get Spell Leech, take those, remove this node, get this node. Because Grasping Wounds is really powerful. To anyone who has not played PoE1, they might think that this node is not very powerful. It is extremely powerful. The item which features this mod in PoE1, called Progenesis Flask, is one of the most expensive and powerful items in the entire game. This thing makes you 25% more effective against one-shots. It basically gives you 25% more defense against a one-shot. This is really important, because in PoE, if you don't get one-shot, you probably live. You get what I mean? Like, one-shots are the biggest bane. And in this game, where everything can one-shot, like, if you die, you lose your boss. If you die, you lose your map. I mean, come on. Preventing one-shots is key. So Grasping Wounds, I think, is really, really important. But at the same time, Sunder of Flesh is going to be really important for damage. So I think the big difficult decision is between Vitality Siphon and Grasping Wounds. If there is no other way to get Leech, then you have to take this, I think, because otherwise you will not be able to sustain your life. Or you solve it some other way. I don't know, life regeneration? Actually, life regeneration, if it's percentage-based, would also work. I don't know if the game has support for this, but if we're going to scale life, and we will scale life, then percentage life regeneration might actually make it so that you don't need Vitality Siphon. Then get this. Grasping Wounds should be very, very good. If you don't scale crit for whatever reason, then you just go this, 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 and this. Then Crimson Power is also going to be very good. Okay, that covers the Ascendancy. Overall, I think Blood Mage is a really nice Ascendancy. I think it's very bad early game. Like, it's pretty bad early game. If you don't scale crit, it's very difficult to sustain this shit. Vitality Siphon, like, you don't have any nodes. But at some point, it will become very good, I think. That's kind of my logic with this. For clear, Life Remnants are very nice. They do sustain you quite nicely, so I think it's pretty fine. So yeah, overall, yeah, it's a non-ascendancy initially, but after a while, I think this will scale very well. It should become a very good late-game ascendancy. Okay, do I have additional notes here? So we went through the ascendancy points, future work. Okay, so how do we finish this? So at some point I go crit, because if we look at crit, here's a lot of crit. We have 1, 2, where was it more? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 7 whole nodes just in the north side of the tree that give crit. If you look at the south side, actually, it has less. So mages are actually being incentivized. Like, as I understand, this is probably Mark's design for the skill tree in this case. I'm not sure if it's Jonathan or Mark's who have been the main architects behind this skill tree, or maybe some other game dev at GGG. But they clearly made it so that spells have a lot of benefits with crit. Like, there's a lot of synergy here. Usually, I think when you want to make a really, really good build in Path of Exile, you need to look at what the tree looks like, and you want to look for locality. You don't want a tree that's all over the place. If you're playing a witch and you're playing spells, you want to stick to the north side. You don't want to be going all the way south because you're going to waste a lot of points on these random highway nodes. So yeah, crit is supported. I think with this ascendancy point, with this with Sunder of the Flesh and a bunch of crit nodes, you will have really good crit. At that point, I think these nodes can be removed because you will have so much base damage that you don't need this additional help for freezing. Increased chaos damage, you can also remove at that point. Like, these 4 nodes will be unnecessary. This is probably necessary because you want the skill effect duration. These I think you can remove. Yeah, so you could also remove this wheel, turn this all into crit. Then it will be very good. What's the last part? So, the last part of this whole. As I said, this build is janky as fuck. You need to cast the Sigil of Power. You need to cast the Totem. Then you need to start casting these spells. Now, I should preface this. This is from the perspective of a Path of Exile 1 veteran. Path of Exile 1 players are used to builds that are one-button builds. You basically have one skill, and you just spam that skill, and you kill everything. That's how we like to play the game. Path of Exile 2 is clearly not that type of game. In this game, you're supposed to use a wide variety of spells, a lot of skills, because all of them can be socketed by supports. Cool, I accept that. However, still, if possible, I would like to minimize the amount of suffering in the world. And so instead of having to cast doing all these pre-steps, I would rather automate this. So the question is, can we automate this? I believe we probably can. So I think we need this, just to look at this a little bit. So cast and critical. So there is this persistent meta gem. It is quite expensive. It's 100 spirit. However, if we scale crit, there's a very important point here. If we scale crit, Dark Effigy, I'm pretty certain is also going to crit. It has a critical chance of 11%. So we can get this to 100% pretty easily. If Dark Effigy is always critting and off every single debuff, it will deal more projectiles. That is more crits per second. If we then socket Essence Drain and Contagion, and I don't know, Sigil of Power or something? Okay, not Sigil of Power. Contagion, Essence Drain, and maybe Dark Effigy itself. If we socket all 3 of these inside cast and crit, I believe this will become an infinite feedback loop, where basically the effigy is going to keep respawning the effigy, and it will keep recasting the Contagion and the Essence Drain. At that point, these things are just going to work in harmony, and you will never have to press this again. This will then be an automatic application of Withered, automatic application of the support to cast freezes with Chaos, and automatic application of the debuffs themselves, which are powerful. And then maybe, I don't know, maybe you put something else in this. Once you have a 6-link, maybe you have some room. What do we have? So we have the effigy. Actually, no, you will not have enough room. But regardless, I think this is the way. So at some point, I will make it so that I will have to cast an initial effigy. So I cast 1 effigy. I cast 1 Essence Drain. Actually, I will not be able to do this because it will be in the support gem. Regardless, there has to be a way. Actually, it's the first crits. Yes. So I start hitting the mob, the boss. Every single hit is going to be a crit because I will get a full crit chance. After a few attacks, it will spawn the effigy as well as the debuffs. The effigy will start hitting it, and then it will feedback, and then it will keep recasting itself. Yes, that's the way. So I believe this should work. I'm not sure. I haven't tested it. It will take a lot of resources to test it. I need to transition to crit to do this. Personal opinion, from having looked at the tree and everything, I would say that level 67 is probably still too early, maybe. Actually, maybe it's not. So once I do deferred lab, if I sacrifice Vitality Siphon and instead get these 2 nodes now, I should be able to do it. However, I really don't want to sacrifice Vitality Siphon. I think it's really, really important because otherwise you will lack sustain. So ideally, I guess the crit transition has to happen once you have 4 points, or 8 points. Once you have finished all the Ascendancy trials, then you can get this. But if you can find a way to solve life without Vitality Siphon, then I guess you could immediately get Sunder of Flesh right after you finish the Cruel Act 3. At that point, you make the transition into crit. Then you can incorporate automation, and then I think this build will become pretty much insane. From everything I see so far, from how many ways you can scale it, how amazing the synergies are, area of effect, skill effect duration, both scale everything in this build. I think that alone, plus when we add crit, will make this thing really, really powerful. We are very point efficient. We are very attribute efficient. Sorry, one click. We're not using that many skills. At some point, I think everything will be automated. The clear is amazing. The decompose makes it very nice. For clear, it's a 1-button build, so 90% of your time playing the game, you will be only pressing 1 attack, which is the Hexblast itself. You don't need to press anything else. For bossing, it's a little bit more complicated, but in respect to everything else in PoE2, I think it's fine. So that covers it. That's it. That's the build. That's my first build diary. I make builds like this all the time. This is basically the thing I do. In PoE1, I make a lot of builds usually around mana, because mana builds I think are some of the most complicated builds in PoE1. I have looked at mana for PoE2, and I have looked at Chronomancer, and I think a mana Chronomancer build could be some of the most busted stuff you could make in PoE2. I will definitely make builds on that at some point. However, it will take a while. Next week I go on vacation for 3 weeks, so I'm not going to be posting anything for a very long time. However, at the end of this week I will post an update on this build and see how the concept has materialized once I add crit. And yeah, if people are interested in the types of builds I make, all my builds are like this, where I look for synergies, where I look for these complicated interactions between everything. If you like them, then I will post them more in the future whenever I come up with new builds. So with that, I leave you, and toward the end, enjoy a few boss fights at the end of Act 3 Cruel that showcase a little bit of the potential of this build. So yeah, that's it from me. Until next time.
Can't give up. I must save my people.
You know why we're here! It happened! It cannot be stopped!
No, I will succeed. There is no escape. what true intellect looks like. Nothing will stand in my way! I will crush you! Are you truly able to match me? No! You are within my grasp! Fake your ambition! This is not over yet! Burn to ash, demon of Atzoator! Full power! No! Do not fail me! Not now!